Welcome back to The Explainer. I am so pumped to dive into this one with you today. Take a quick second to think about the smartphone sitting right there in your pocket, or maybe on your desk. That little piece of glass and metal, it is the direct result of an absolutely epic journey. We're talking resilience, massive vision, and just relentless innovation. Today, we're unpacking the life, the mind, and the incredible legacy of Steve Jobs. But before we get to all the massive triumphs, I want you to consider this quote for a second. Getting fired from Apple was the best thing that ever happened to me. I mean, really think about that. How in the world does a guy whose absolute lowest moment involved being forced out of his very own dream company end up reinventing himself and building an empire that completely changed the world? Well, let's dive in and figure it out. Part 1. The Garage and the Vision. You know, every great hero's journey has an origin story, right? And Steve's is built on this just insatiable early curiosity. He was born in San Francisco in 1955 and was adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs. His dad, Paul, was actually a mechanic, and he would take young Steve out to the family garage and teach him how to tinker with electronics. That was the initial spark. Fast forward a little bit, and Steve actually drops out of Reed College in 1972. By 1974, he's backpacking across India, seeking spiritual enlightenment and exploring Buddhism. So you have these two totally different worlds crashing together, garage engineering and Eastern philosophy. And those two things actually planted the seeds for his famous minimalist approach. Then, in 1976, he teams up with engineering genius Steve Wozniak to found Apple Computer. And to fund their very first project, the Apple I, Wozniak literally sold his scientific calculator, and Jobs sold his beloved Volkswagen van. They just did whatever it took. And here's something truly fascinating about how completely random dots connect later in life. Remember I said he dropped out of Reed College? He actually did that because the crazy expensive tuition was draining his parents' life savings. But he didn't stop learning. He just hung around and started auditing classes that he actually found interesting. One of those happened to be a calligraphy course. At the time, people thought it was completely useless. But years later, that exact class became the direct inspiration for the beautiful, revolutionary typography and fonts on the first Macintosh computers. Which brings us to part 2, success, betrayal, and reinvention. So, Apple's rise was incredibly rapid. In 1980, the company went public, and by the time Steve was just 25 years old, his net worth absolutely exploded overnight. We're talking over $200 million. By any metric, it was an astronomical success. But here's the kicker. Money wasn't actually his true motivation. What he really wanted, his ultimate dream, was to build products that fundamentally changed how people lived. And that philosophy was the driving force behind the 1984 Macintosh. The Mac was a total revolution. It had a graphical user interface, a mouse so you didn't just have to type green text commands, and of course, it launched with that famous 1984 Super Bowl commercial. But despite being completely revolutionary, those early sales actually ended up disappointing investors. And that leads us to a crucial turning point. Because in 1985, at just 30 years old, in one of the most shocking moments in corporate history, Steve Jobs was forced out of Apple. Just imagine that for a second. You build your dream company from scratch in a garage, and then you get fired from it. It was a massive blow, a true dark night of the soul. But instead of just packing it in and giving up, he completely reinvented himself. During his time away from Apple, he made two massive pivots. On one hand, he founded a company called Next. Now, the computers were super expensive and sales were pretty small, but the operating system technology they built, it was years ahead of its time. On the other hand, he bought a tiny animation company from George Lucas for $10 million. You might have heard of it. It was called Pixar. Honestly, almost no one believed in it at first. That is, until they released the world's first fully computer-animated feature film, Toy Story, in 1995. It was a total smash hit. Pixar went on to create blockbuster after blockbuster, and eventually, Disney bought them for $7.4 billion, which actually made Jobs Disney's largest individual shareholder. Now for part 3, the grand return to Apple. All right, this is where the story kicks into high gear. By 1997, Apple was in bad shape. They were losing money, bleeding customers, and hovering dangerously close to bankruptcy. So they did something desperate. They bought Next. And by buying Next, they brought Steve Jobs back into the fold. Once he was back, he took some very specific tactical steps to rescue the company. First, he officially returned as CEO. Second, he relentlessly slashed and simplified their incredibly confusing product lineup. Third, he enforced this absolutely strict focus on quality over quantity. And fourth, in 1998, he launched the iMac. You remember those? The really colorful, unique ones? Its design attracted millions of buyers, and just like that, Apple was back to profitability. Part 4. The Mobile Device Revolution. This is the era that basically built the modern world you and I live in right now. In 2001, Apple launched the iPod, and Jobs introduced it to the world using just one brilliantly simple sentence: 1,000 songs in your pocket. When you paired that little device with iTunes, it revolutionized the entire digital music industry overnight. Millions of people bought one, and it changed how the world listened to music forever. But his absolute greatest presentation, the one people still study today, that happened on January 9th, 2007. Picture the tension in the room for a second. He's standing on stage, and he uses the classic rule of 3. He tells the audience that Apple is introducing 3 distinct revolutionary products today: a widescreen iPod, a revolutionary phone, and a breakthrough internet communicator. And he'd just kept repeating those 3 things over and over until he dropped the ultimate punchline. They were not 3 separate devices. They were all one device: the iPhone. The audience completely erupted. It was a masterclass in presentation, sure, but way more importantly, it transformed global communication forever. The billions of smartphones we all use today are entirely inspired by that exact moment on stage. The relentless momentum he had in those later years was just staggering. After the iPhone in 2007 came the App Store in 2008, which empowered developers globally and literally created millions of new jobs. Then, in 2010, even though early critics heavily doubted it, Apple launched the iPad. It created a totally new tech category that millions of people fell in love with. And soon after, in 2011, he introduced Apple's cloud services to tie it all together. Part 5. A Visionary's Lasting Legacy. Now, behind all of that relentless momentum and public success, Jobs was actually fighting a deeply personal battle with pancreatic cancer. He ultimately passed away in 2011 at just 56 years old. The world definitely mourned the loss, but his vision, it absolutely remains with us. If we distill his entire incredible life down, here are the core takeaways you can actually apply to your own journey right now. Number 1, stay curious, never ever stop learning. Just think about that random calligraphy class, right? 2, simplicity wins. The absolute simplest ideas are so often the greatest ones. 3, don't fear failure. Remember, getting fired from his own company became his single greatest opportunity for growth. 4, follow your passion. You have to love what you do. And 5, think different. True innovation only happens when you're willing to challenge the ordinary. Because listen, success isn't about avoiding failure, it's about learning from it. I want to leave you with one final thought today, and it's totally inspired by his famous advice to stay hungry, stay foolish. You see, the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are almost always the ones who actually do. So I have to ask you, are you crazy enough to think you can change the world? I challenge you to take these lessons, apply them to your own life, and find out what you're capable of. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.